Thank you, Joshua. We have two very interesting presentations raising a lot of issues. And I guess we raise a lot of questions. Maybe we are starting clockwise. And the first I see on the list is Jean-Pierre.
I don't know where on the clock, but I'm very happy to start. So, first I'd like maybe to disentangle two of the arguments that Professor Eisenman made, because I agree with one and disagree with the other. So, the one I disagree with is that there is something like a global financial cycle. There is something like a global financial cycle that we can see in increased correlation between indicators of financial condition in various countries. So we see that on the data. We can, and the BIS elaborated a lot about the drivers. This is basically, to make it simple, about dollar funding. Dollar funding plays a major role in the drivers of capital flows and financial condition. And so the dollar conditions, in a way, are a big driver of financial conditions worldwide. Those correlations may imply complex causations. For instance, there have been a reverse causation between long-term interest rates in the euro area and the US, and the euro area has been driving the US rates more than the reverse over the last 18 months. But there is something like a global financial cycle, I think. The second point on which I agree is that from that you shouldn't jump to the extreme conclusion that exchange rates have no insulation property and no role to play in the adjustment. That was maybe a little bit fast in the Hélène Rey reasoning. I think she's right on the first point, and she may be too extreme on the second. And the counterfactual that Professor Eisenman mentioned about what would happen if some countries have not the flexibility of some letting their exchange rate float. So I think these are two arguments, and they should deserve to be on the spillovers. I think what makes the coordination problem different today is that the spillovers are heavily influenced by the zero lower bound. And in my view, the debate in emerging economy has been a little bit obscured because people are focusing on asset purchasing and non-conventional measures as major driver of capital flows. I think the fact that interest rate policy rate at zero is much more important in explaining the sort of volatility of capital flows all over the world. The fact that the liquidity trap is exported between advanced economy, as Shane said, and the fact that there's an enormous risk sensitivity on capital flows between advanced and emerging economies. So it's a question of the zero lower bound, and that puts immediately the limits on what kind of cooperation we have, because the only possibility will be for advanced economy to get out of the zero lower bound, and we see now how difficult it is, referring to yesterday. So this is the basic reason why we cannot have big cooperation. Everybody is stuck at the zero lower. At the zero lower bound, the system is inherently unstable. That's why macroprudential policy and capital flow management are important. What could do, and I would only again refer to yesterday, I think the one thing that monetary authority can do is to be predictable, not to surprise the markets. That's what has been creating huge negative spillover effects. And we have two big examples, I think. The China change in exchange rate regime, if it had been announced, prepared, and pre-announced, it would not have brought the kind of havoc it has brought on global capital market. But China has been extremely predictable for 15 years and actually bringing a lot of stability to the global capital market for two crises, the Asian crisis in the 90s and the crisis in 2000. And suddenly they became totally unpredictable. And that, my view, came as a shock. And the second example is, of course, the forward guidance in the US and the data-driven exit of the zero lower bound in the US. And since it's data-driven, and the data itself is very, very volatile, it's totally unpredictable. So my guess is that if we had to ask something rather than elaborating extremely complex collaborative schemes, the one thing the big country owes to the world is to be predictable in their reaction function in monetary policy, even if it involves a little bit less fine-tuning on the day-to-day. And finally, I have a question, and it's a little bit of an afterthought about yesterday's session about currency wars. And my question is this. The term has been coined by Minister Manteiga from Brazil like 6 or 7 years ago. And if I'm correct, he coined it as not so much meaning currency wars between big advanced economies or China and the US, but between emerging economies fighting for their market shares on the markets of big economies like the US or China. So do the emerging economies authorities who are represented, do they see currency volatility between emerging economies as a threat to the stability of the global system? I should have asked that question yesterday. I'm sorry to ask it, and maybe the IMF thinks the same.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Next one is Andrew.
Yeah, I liked both presentations. I have a comment for each. So this is sort of related to Joshua and actually relates to your last question too, your last point, Jean-Pierre. So in our last macro report, we had these country-by-country VARs, and the result on Colombia was interesting. So, which was that a unilateral depreciation of the Colombian peso didn't seem to do too much for growth in Colombia. But the ability to be able to depreciate the Colombian peso in the face of an oil price shock was very important. So in other words, it's kind of very important to condition on the shock. And I wonder if you don't seem to condition on the shock, but I wondered if that's an important consideration. We also, I mean, having said that, well, it follows on. We had a sort of comparison between Colombia and Ecuador, which many people are surprised at the importance of oil in Colombia, but it's all, you know, it's not that far off Ecuador in terms of exports, and clearly the ability to depreciate the peso in face of the oil price shock was extremely favorable for Colombia, related to the size of the shock that created in Ecuador. Just on that last point that Jean-Pierre made, we also have in our report a chapter on how the nominal depreciations in Latin America have or have not translated into real depreciations. And actually, kind of surprisingly to us, only 3 countries really depreciated in real terms, despite large nominal depreciations. They were Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. So Peru, which has a big nominal devaluation, actually didn't have much of a real devaluation, partly because of devaluations of trading partners. It's quite a complicated analysis, because actually we did it going down to the product level, and then also taking into account who you're competing with into third markets. So we have a sort of new definition of a kind of a competition-adjusted real exchange rate. And there'll be a paper from my colleagues Andres Fernandez and Ernesto Stein, which define that quite precisely, and it goes very much to your point. On your presentation, I wanted to ask a question which I didn't quite understand, the currency war scenario. I mean, the Fed will act always in whatever way it thinks is best for the U.S. economy, I presume. I take that as sort of given. So my question is, you know, is there, do you or Frank will make the case that the non-cooperative solution ends up being worse? You know, even though the U.S. is acting in what it thinks is the best for the U.S., it ends up with this non-cooperative solution, which is actually worse for the U.S. Is that what I? Okay, all right, thanks. Roberto.
Yes, thank you for the very interesting presentation. As to the trilemma versus dilemma point, I think I'm sympathetic to Elaine Gray's point, although I think that she misses the most important question, which is not that countries cannot actually float, but they choose not to float. I think that at the end the question is, well, why is it that countries display what Calvo and Reinhardt called fear of floating? And actually, that turns out to be, to me, you know, a very interesting question from a number of viewpoints. For example, I was actually giving a talk at in Norway a month ago, and talking to people at the central bank there, and I was asking myself, well, why is Norway not Venezuela, right? And then I became convinced that a big part of the answer was, well, you know, Norway could actually engineer a 40% depreciation of the krona, and you don't even notice it. I mean, people say, yeah, this is what we needed in order to actually get, adjust to the drop in the price of oil, and it will be good for the adjustment in the non-oil sector. So, this society has, I guess, that social fabric or institutions that actually allow the central bank to live with a depreciation of that size, without society actually creating the pressures to actually prevent the adjustment via the necessary change in the relative prices. I mean, not that they, I could only imagine, well, if I have a Latin American country that has a research fund that is about 3 times the GDP of the country, right, and can intervene in order to actually prevent the depreciation, I cannot imagine the social pressures on the central bank governor in order to actually prevent that kind of adjustment. But maybe that's what we should be thinking about. What are the institutions or the what is exactly what allows a country like Norway to float in this way. So I think that's actually what this debate misses. It's not that countries cannot float; they choose not to. Right? As for coordination, I mean, the discussion of coordination was very interesting, but I always end up asking myself what it means for developing countries and emerging economies. And here I am relatively realistically pessimistic. I think that one of the reasons is what Andy Powell already said, that the Federal Reserve is always going to choose monetary policy in the interests of the United States population, and considerations about the rest of the world are important only to the extent that they impinge upon the United States interests, and that's not going to change. And the literature is not going to actually help us that much, right? I mean, I've written on international policy coordination. In fact, I wrote a dissertation and published a number of papers on this issue, and it's actually good for publishing. But in practice, in the 25 years that I've been writing papers, I have seen no progress that is relevant for developing economies in terms of international policy coordination. I'm sorry to say that the only way out for emerging economies is essentially to self-insure against the war shocks. And if you actually want to spend time talking about, well, maybe we can actually come up with another coordination scheme or so on, you have to contend with all the different theoretical problems that actually you described.
Joaquin?
Thank you. I want to bring the case of Brazil, which is an interesting example of, having tried to maintain independence in monetary policy in a very active world in terms of flows and terms of trade and everything else. So when you look at the situation now, after having gone through a bonanza and the bust that followed it, Brazil, which accumulated reserves in great quantities and sterilized or did engage in also in sterilized intervention, today faces the cost of those past sterilization policies. The stock of repos that the central bank has in its liability is 1 trillion reais. The interest rate, Selic, is what remunerates those repos at 14.25%. That's 140 billion reais, which compared to a GDP of roughly 6 trillion reais means that 2.4%, roughly 2.5% of GDP is the annual cost that is the result of sterilized intervention. Now, you could say, is Brazil, you could speculate, did they go too far in terms of accumulating reserves past the optimal level? And here, it's good that they have the reserves, but compared to the amount of liquid assets that can, at the given moment in time, say, worst case scenario, run against them, Well, M4 is 4 times those reserves, so they are not necessarily large relative to the great amount of liquid assets that are in the system. The other puzzling thing is that despite their very active policy in trying to maintain these high interest rates to avoid overheating and bring inflation down, there has been the behavior of credit during the boom was something that was disconnected with the interest rate. Of course, there was this other parallel credit system that they have subsidizing credit through BNDES and other things, so an inconsistency of their own in the management of monetary policy. But then what is the problem here? When you consider that Brazil had the largest real appreciation during the boom per 1% improvement in terms of trade. So granted, all currencies appreciated because of terms of trade improvements in South America, but in Brazil it was 7 times more than in Chile per % of improvement in terms of trade. There has to be an idiosyncratic reason, and to me it was that interest rates were way too high. And so the problem here is not the accumulation of reserves, which you have to do, is trying to follow an IT rule which was never designed for a country like Brazil. Now today, in the past, Minister Levy tried to reintroduce the CPMF tax, a tax on financial transactions that would, in the base case scenario, raise 1% of GDP, and didn't pass. And mark my words, the CPMF is going to be reintroduced again by Minister Meirelles at some point. Here's another alternative. Why those repos are not transformed into reserve requirements, mandatory reserve requirements, that pay half of the Selic rate, therefore they are an implicit tax on financial intermediation that would collect 1.2% of GDP, half of the 2.4 I mentioned before, and which, then the question is, which one is more distortionary, the CPMF or this tax on financial intermediation? But the advantage is this tax can be established by the central bank without passing through Congress and everything. And at the bottom of the problem is sterilization has its cost. A blind pursuit of IT also does, and in the discussion of tax policies, people lose track of the fact all taxes are distortionary, so better be practical and choose the one that can be implemented expeditiously.
2 very quick comments. I mean, we did a lot of work. I mean, if you look at you can say that about 50% of the world is basically in the dollar block, depending on how you measure it, for PPP or simple market GDP weights. And we know that it's not this is a suboptimal currency. I think overall we all agree on that. Basically, things work pretty well when the cycles are synchronized. As soon as they are not synchronized, as it is the case now, with the US inclined more to tightening and the other part of the world, emerging market included, of course, towards loosening, the situation does not work. Actually, there is similarity also with the euro area, if you want. Now, the question for me, the fundamental question, to move away from that US dollar-centric type of system. And I think this is the fundamental question that I always find time after time when I talk to central banks. And actually, the reality is that probably we we are moving actually back to the US dollar even more as we speak. Because if you look at the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves, see, when the euro was launched, it was introduced, you saw the euro rising and the US dollar coming down. And actually the euro was rising pretty fast because a lot of central bankers, when they look at their composition of foreign exchange reserve, the fundamental question is, we have too much dollar, we need less dollar. The problem is, with what do we replace the dollar? And the euro was is an ideal candidate. And actually, it came very strongly, and it touched a peak of around 28%, if you want, during just before the euro crisis erupted. Then the euro crisis erupted. The euro lost that role. There was no more demand for the euro came down, which I believe it is legitimate. If you are someone who wants to preserve the liquidity of the country, and you have existential problem concerning one currency, you probably don't want to have the currency, at least beyond what is required for trade or currency management purpose. Now the question comes with the RMB, and I think the Chinese are pretty clear that what they're trying to do is to move away from the US dollar-centric system, and actually I remember the speech from the governor about the SDR. Now if you look at the last 5 years, and we did a lot of work, actually the RMB currently probably represent 1% of global reserves. There are estimates, but I believe 1% is a more or less accurate estimate. How much can it be the RMB, let's say, in the next 5 years? If you do all the calculation and the maths, and you include the international institution, we use the SDR, so by having the RMB in the SDR, they will have to have more RMB in there. Probably you can come up with an estimate of, let's say, 5% of global reserves in 5 years' time. I think it is legitimate to assume that will be RMB denominated. So still the dollar will be, let's say, 55–60% of the overall global financial architecture. So in 5 years' time, basically, we will not have the change which is required, which is basically to have a multipolar currency system where you have the dollar, let's say, 30–40%, the euro another 30%, and the RMB and the surrounding region another 30%. So from that point of view, it becomes really interesting, and I agree on that point that it is about policy here now. If you really want to move away from that type of financial system and you just let the market decide, this is probably a process which will require eventually, if everything goes well, I would say a few decades at least, so 20–30 years before we actually reach that end point. So the question becomes, can eventually policy at the global level accelerate this process, which of course would require that everybody else, including the one who at the moment have also some benefits from the dollar-centric system, eventually allow that. For me, this is a question which sometimes is not asked very often, because I guess the feeling that is because it's considered so far away to reach such a political commitment that nobody even asked it, because we know that in the end there will never be policy coordination. But I would like to have the opinion of the two presenters, if they think and they foresee something like that eventually feasible, not tomorrow, but not even in 30 years, but rather maybe within this decade, for instance. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not a perfect visibility, but I think that, okay. just before giving the floor to Shane and Joshua, I have a couple of remarks. The first one rejoins the last one, is the proposal made by Shane about the SDR, which is a recurrent proposal, and to some extent it could be considered a second or third best to the problem of having a multipolar currency system. And I remember in a paper in 2011, Mervyn King said that the SDR is a reserve asset, but it cannot be a reserve currency. So what do you think about that? And bearing in mind also that there is no great appetite, neither on the investor side nor on the policymakers side. And my second remark, you alluded to the asymmetry of the correction underlying in the correction of the global imbalance, and with the underlying idea that some countries have, if I understand where you were, have specific responsibilities, that it's the moral hazard versus locomotive game in reducing the output gap with reference of the potential goals that used to be before the crisis. So do you consider that this is a good reference, which is a sustainable one? And in that case, and if we do so, what could be the good forum? I'm not sure there is one in order to force those countries to apply such an optimal policy. So maybe now we have 5 minutes. Joshua, you start first.
I would like to thank all the comments, and of course in 5 minutes I'm not going to reply to all of them. So I'm not sure if I'm following the disagreement part, the 50% that we potentially disagree of Jean-Pierre. So let me point out that I'm agnostic about the possibility of the presence of global credit or financial cycle. So we can think about statistical definition. This is very easy, principal, components, or whatever. The deeper issue is what is hidden behind this, and to what degree it's stable or changes, or there are endogenous changes. Let me point out that in a recent paper, Mike Bordeaux claimed that he disagreed that there is nothing like a global credit cycle. My take is, let the data tell us, subject to the understanding, going back to Ed Limer, that we cannot conduct controlled experiments. Now, if this concept is leading Hélène to conclude that exchange rate regimes are irrelevant, the point is that we need a much more refined structure to check it, and when we are doing the best control for this, we don't see this conclusion in data. Now, admittedly, during the crisis, of course, it started in the US. The share of the US is more than 50%, so everybody initially was impacted. But beyond this, statistically, I can define a lot of cycles, including global credit cycles. The question is, what is the economic meaning of it? Hélène is trying to push it into killing the trilemma. We don't see this. And I expect that the current literature will debate the point of Mike Bordeaux, that he is not believing in this, and other people. I'm agnostic, but I would like to see more stability. Now, I fully agree with you that predictability of monetary policy is great, but the underlying stochastic structure is changing. And suddenly, we are confronting unanticipated events, and there is a learning process. So my view of monetary policy is more along the Darwin type of evolution. Stan Fisher at the IMF was against hoarding reserves. Then in 2000, I believe, 6, he decided suddenly that Israel is going to hoard reserves like crazy. So he did the best to make it predictable by a short statement that he would like to double or triple the reserve to GDP. But this is an example that governors or countries may change their way of conducting monetary and financial policies, and then the challenge is to design a smooth transition. And you're right, we are learning from experience, and I think that also Stan Fisher in the past, the IMF did, I believe, some mistakes, but everybody is trying to learn over time, and that's part of the game. And I'm sure that China is another example of learning in real time, and sometimes the learning is costly. And of course, the US learned before the crisis. The administration argued never bailouts, and we know that within a week or a day, they changed their... so this is another example of the lack of predictability, and this will stay forever. The issue is how to minimize the transition. Now, regarding currency wars, and here I'm dealing with Andy's comments and the like. First, Andy, we are trying to control for terms of trade shocks, which are, for most countries, the best exogenous shock. So we are controlling it, and in other papers, we dealt with Latin America in this context with Daniel and the like. So I'm sympathetic with what you are saying. But the notion of currency wars is really part of a complex interaction. Well before the crisis, Ing-Wong Chuang argued that there is skipping with the Joneses element of hoarding reserves in a way that is conditioned by the reserves of your neighbors. So this type of interaction happened before the crisis and during the crisis and after. Now, when all countries are close to full employment, this effect is not the source of a lot of frictions. It's really I agree with Jean-Pierre that when you are approaching the zero lower boundary, so things that were fine before the crisis suddenly may generate a lot of adverse externalities. And it would have been nice to generate a deeper coordination. I'm sympathetic with the point of Jeff Frankel that this is the wishful dream of a typical economist, but the data suggests to us that the political constraints internally are restricting this. And my own view about this, by chance I was the discussant of Jeff Frankel, and my point was you need really an unanticipated large shock that is threatening the stability of the global system to induce the US to open up swap lines in the way that they opened up. So it's not that the US is ignoring the global economy, but the charter, the official mandate is not including this, but the US at least passed this low bar test that they were willing to provide the ECB elastic at the margin unlimited access to prevent the unwinding of the global economic order. So let me move fast to Roberto. I'm not sure if I understand your point that you agree with Hélène because you believe that the global economy is characterized by the fear of floating. My sense, the fear of floating is a moving target. Look at Russia and Brazil. I don't think that you detect a stable fear of floating. Russia exhausted a lot of reserves, rightly so. I think the governor there is doing fine job. I don't detect any fear of floating in Russia. Now, I agree that there are spells where countries, including Russia, are characterized by conditional fear of floating. But you should control for this. So I disagree with the statement that everybody is characterized by fear of floating. It's a moving target. There is fear of floating. There's fear of losing reserves. But if you are facing big enough shocks, so you are changing your strategy. And the role of, I think, of the econometric work that I'm trying to do in the new paper is to try to condition, trying to understand under what conditions countries like Russia will use reserves, depleting maybe 60%. In other conditions, they will be characterized by the fear of floating. So let the data tell you, subject to all the constraints of historical data. Now, going back to Jeff Frankel's, I'm sympathetic with him that in normal times, don't presume that there is willingness to cooperate. Having said that, if there is enough long-term agenda, the hope is that there will be greater willingness to coordinate the big picture. And here, going back to Marx and the implicit agenda of a lot of these conferences, it would be nice to clarify what can be coordinated well before chaotic events that are changing the rules of the game in real time. And I'm not totally pessimistic, but it takes time. It took time to coordinate the Bretton Woods agreement, and it took time to destroy it, and maybe it will take time, but it's very hard to predict. Regarding Brazil, the cost of reserves, first, it's fair to say that one should look at the cost of reserves over 10 years, and not in the short run. And there, I think that the cost of reserves for some countries is definitely lower than 2%. And then the question is, first, to what degree there is enough coordination between the monetary branch and the fiscal branch, and if there is no coordination, so you may be right that Brazil is a case of internal coordination difficulties, which is precisely the point of Jeff Frankel, that a lot of the problems are internal, and then it's easy to blame the US for the fiasco of Brazil, but living in California, I believe that I'm sympathetic with at least Jeff's interpretation of Brazil, but I'm not an expert in any way on Brazil. Now, I think that regarding your right comment that it's useful to add tools. We know that always there is scarcity of tools relative to policy goals as a rule of thumb. And you're right that in olden days, central banks were willing occasionally to use in a much more flexible way tools like changing dynamically a reserve requirement on the banking system. We know that China and Hong Kong are using this tool dynamically, and I think that we should revisit continuously the set of tools. And I agree with you that it would be nice to raise these questions formally and to add this as another mechanism. And we know that you can accomplish a lot of stabilization if you are using properly some macroprudential regulations along the line maybe that Korea started using after that Professor Shin was the advisor to the president. And it may include also dynamic application of varying reserve requirements. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll be brief and I won't pick up on all the questions. I'll start with Jean-Pierre, with whom I normally agree 100%, but not this time. In your point about the large, and in particular the U.S., owing stability and predictability to the rest of the world, I would take issue with that, because I think there are cases where certainty has greater cost than policy mistake. To be precise, if the Fed had delivered on its promise to hike 4 times in 2016, I think this would have been a far greater cost to the world economy than the back and forth that we have seen. So I think sometimes uncertainty is a lesser cost than the certainty of a policy mistake. There were a number of questions that amounted to the Fed acting only in its own interest and disregarding the rest of the world. I think that takes us back to a dilemma. I tend to, and there was a nice chart that I wanted to have in my presentation, but I didn't have it here. The references of the Federal Reserve in the last year for the external environment and for the dollar are greater than they have been in 20 years. So it seems that the Fed does sometimes care about the rest of the world more than its mandate would suggest. However, I would qualify that a little bit. I think it's fair to say that if the risk the Fed takes is instability in Brazil, in Mexico, where basically the feedback on the US is probably limited, I think it doesn't care. And then I agree that probably, domestic policy takes precedence. But if the risk it takes is that the second biggest economy in the world goes down the drain, and this is, I think, the situation in which we are now, in which we have been in the last 18 months, then I think that alters the reaction function quite meaningfully. And to me, there is no other explanation for the Fed not adopting a much more aggressive tightening agenda in the last year than its real concern for the situation in China. So I don't think I would agree with the very bold statement that the Fed only cares about the US. I think there are many instances where the Fed actually internalizes, and in this instance, I think rightly so, internalizes the spillover of its policy on China and the feedback that this would create on the US economy. A point about the evolution of the various currencies and whether or not we are moving towards a more multipolar currency regime. It's true that there is a bit of a contradiction between what policymakers are trying to design and what markets are actually doing. What policymakers and people like me that are very internationalist in design are hoping for is a much more multipolar monetary system. And in fact, the IMF inclusion of China in the SDR basket, I think, responds to that philosophy. There are lots of good reasons why the IMF could have rejected China from taking part in the SDR, and in fact, I think in part because of an international philosophical bent, it had decided to do so. On the other hand, markets are doing the opposite, and you're right. I mean, you mentioned the euro, but you could even argue that the yen is becoming less and less of an international currency. Sterling probably is on the verge also of becoming less and less of an international currency. So, the markets are probably moving us to a much more unipolar world than the policy makers would like that to be. And I frankly don't know who will win between these two forces. I do think that policymakers have some leeway in changing the nature of things, but I agree with you that there are some underlying forces that may be greater than the policy forces that are currently mobilized. The last point on SDR, being a reserve asset but never being a reserve currency, and that will take me back as well to the difference between policy and markets. I think that's a very fair view, but we have to explain why. The SDR has never been a reserve currency because the central banks in particular that are taking part in the SDR basket have always been very reluctant to see the SDR grow in size and importance, because the SDR effectively is a claim on their printing press, and that for many of them is an issue. So they've always been reluctant for big SDR allocations, and they've always been reluctant for the growth of the SDR as something more than a dormant reserve asset. The question is whether the markets could actually change that. Could we have big emissions of SDR denominated debt that would therefore force, regardless of what central banks want to do, the SDR to be a much more used currency in the private market? There's no sign of that at the moment, but I don't think it's completely crazy to imagine that if China wanted to issue a large part of its sovereign and private debt in SDR, that could start to change, the appetite for SDR-denominated assets, and therefore gradually move the needle. Last point on coordination and the general skepticism over coordination. I'm more optimistic or more naive than you are. Maybe because I was involved in economic policy coordination, so I don't want to believe that it doesn't work. But also because I think there are instances where they are clear. I think we have made the case quite convincingly that economic policy coordination in situation of crisis, let's go back to G20 2009, fiscal expansion 2008. I think we've made the demonstration that works. What we haven't proven is that economic policy coordination can also work in fair weather. And on this also, I'm a bit more hopeful than you are. Because I perceive signs of coordination that don't take the form of an official G20 communique, or don't take the form of an agreement between central bankers or ministries of finance. But what we have observed in the last year, in particular this tango between the US and China, resembles to me a lot of what you would have hoped from a coordinated outcome.
Thank you very much. And I think we can thank the two speakers and all the participants in this session. And okay, maybe you have the...
Thank you for the presentations, the comments. Now it's time for lunch. We are going to have dinner for those remaining here. We're supposed to meet at the lobby, I suppose, at 7:45 p.m. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.